All right, looks like it's slowed up enough to get started. Thank you again. This has been a great group, on time, ready to start right at 1. Thank you so much. All right, so most of you probably were with us yesterday when we talked about the core concepts, the part A and part B, and we asked you to come today for the writing to make sure that you knew the requirements for writing. Some of you may have been with us this morning when we did the science, if you teach 5, 8, or high school. But this is for the ELA writing. And some of you may have shown up for just a refresher. And at the end of my session, we were going to have Laura Hines is going to talk about students using access skills for writing. So let's get started. We're going to talk about what ELA writing does assess. It is all about expressive communication by the student, for them to share experiences, to offer their preferences, to talk about ideas, maybe give facts on things they really love to talk about, discussing books, articles, look at videos and tell us about those. Definitely using poetry and imagery with our kids and sharing what they know with others. So writing is about expressive communication. What writing is not is a student's ability to hold a writing instrument. It's not whether or not they can use a pencil or a marker. It's also not about copying words and letters that you give them. And above all, I beg you, do not highlight the words that they've just told you and make them go over them. This is not an OT exercise. This is speech and language. This is expressive communication. So please don't torture them after they've just told you a great thing that they did and then make them go and copy it or use the pencil to go over the highlighted areas. So let's think about your students. Well, how does your student communicate? This is one of those times where I feel like the state has done a good thing by having you assess expressive communication. Because if your student does not have a way to communicate, you need to let someone know and say, look, the state is requiring that we assess this student, and I don't have any way for this student to communicate. I don't have a high-tech device. I don't have a low-tech device. I need help. So there's a long list here. I may be missing something. That's why we have the other. But how does your student communicate? Do they speak? Do they write? Do they make sounds? Do they use symbols? Are they still using objects? Do they gesture? Do they use sign language? Perhaps they use an eye gaze, or do they use a high-tech device that's a dynamic display, such as Proloquo to Go or a Dynavox, or maybe just using PECs, and they have a communication book. So there's a lot of different ways that your student can communicate. Here are the requirements. This you're going to hear, right, so many times. You need a completed writing skill survey. Also, I'm sorry I didn't say this, but we're going to wait till the end for the questions, just like we did with the science and the core concepts. It's just easier if you pay attention to what we're telling you, and then we'll be happy to answer your questions. Okay. So you need a skill survey, a baseline writing sample. Now that's something you can do when you go back to the class tomorrow. It's just a student's first attempt at that writing process. And it can be them telling you, it can be actually writing, however your student communicates. You just want that first attempt, and you want it dated prior to your final samples. It can be a brainstorming activity, a graphic organizer, an outline, whatever you want it to be. This helps you see what that student needs. So when you look at that first attempt, it gives you an idea of what you want to focus on to help that student. Now, everything else I've been saying to you, get started. Don't wait. Make sure that you have something in place. But with writing, I feel like writing is something you can take your time with. Once you get that initial baseline done, you can take your time and continually work on different areas of writing until you come up with 3 final writing samples. And there'll be 3 different writing samples. They'll be on different topics or different pictures. They won't be the same thing rewritten 3 times, 3 different final writing samples. So you have from now until the end of February, beginning of March, to get those 3 final samples. So you want to show their best work. Then you want to give us 3 pre-scored state-provided rubrics, which I'll show you. You're going to have 1 for each sample. And also, you want to have those 3 final writing samples include all the information that we've talked about on every piece of evidence. We want the student's name, a valid date, and in this case for writing, we want the percentage of independence. That's what we're looking for on this one. If you're doing access skills, and we'll obviously go into more depth when I'm done with my part of this, but final samples for students who are going to be using access skills will include a written product that's produced either by the teacher or the peers. But what you're going to do is note the student's participation in that final writing product. So here is the writing skill survey. Make sure that you have it filled out. Remember, Kevin showed us how to make sure we had the whole thing filled out. So all 9 of those need to be completed. And we're going to look to what areas we think our student needs to work on. Based on this, you have a lot of different choices. And maybe for your student, you would have even more choices depending on the student. But this is expressive communication. This is what the required elements for writing would look like. So you have the skill survey first, a work description for the baseline, and then the baseline writing sample. Now, in this case, it was just a handwritten one. It could be, remember, anything. We're not going to score the baseline. It's for you to determine what you want to work on before you do your final samples. And here are our 3 finals. We have 3 final work descriptions, 3 final writing samples, and then 3 scoring rubrics that you will fill out. And as Kevin will show you, the only difference between this final work description and the baseline is the words that are there. One says final, one says baseline. They work the same way. This is what matters. You're going to make sure that you have 3 distinctly different writing samples, but whatever date you do your writing sample on, please make sure that the work description as well as the scoring rubric have the same dates on them. It's just very difficult if we're trying, just keep those all 3 the same so that we know which rubric goes with which writing sample. And you have a choice when you're doing the writing samples. You can use 3 different text types, or you can use all the same. You can do 2 information and 1 argument, but the 3 text types here are argument or opinion, which is just about stating a claim or a preference. And all of these can be based on a text or a topic. You can do informative or explanatory. Those are just conveying facts or ideas. And the narrative, which also includes poetry. So it can be a real or imagined story or events, or you can use poetry and figurative language. So what's very different about writing is we're giving you this kind of overall global measurable outcome for the entry point. There's only one entry point, and it depends on which text type you use. So in this case, we can say student will use his or her primary mode of communication to express or create a writing sample. And then if you pick narrative, it would say narrative with 75% independence. I'm putting that independence in there. That's where I want to get with my student. Kevin will show you, but just to make you aware, when you change text types, and it's perfectly acceptable. Like at one point, maybe you're doing a narrative, and then another part of the year you want to do an opinion. So you can do one of each or two of one. But when you change from one text type to another, you are going to get a new strand cover sheet. So some people, it makes them think they're doing something wrong. You're not. So don't worry about it. But Kevin will explain that when he shows you the program. So I said you are going to pre-score the final writing sample. We will give you this scoring rubric, so that's what you'll use. But again, you don't need to score the baseline. Here's a couple of examples of graphic organizers. But you do want to make sure that the scoring rubric is completed so that you've filled in all areas, because that's what the scorers are going to look at just to verify your scores. So what's included on this scoring rubric? First of all, the level of complexity, either access skills or entry points. Same as we've done, yesterday in science and also here. Access skills or entry points, those are your two choices. This is where we're going to get our accuracy from. It's a demonstration of skills and concepts, which is accuracy. And we're going to focus on expressions of ideas and content, use of vocabulary, text structure, so that's words or phrases, sentences, and knowledge of conventions. We're going to take a look at the actual rubric so you can see, but though that's really the heart of it. You're going to still do all pieces of it, but that's really the heart of it. So that's where we get our accuracy from. The independence is going to be based on the frequency of prompts by the word or the sentence, and we'll talk more about that in a bit. Self-evaluation is not on the rubric, but you can include it the same way we have with everything. It can be a separate paper. It can say see attached. It can be written in the work description label. So here's the writing rubric. This is what it looks like. We have a blank one in the educator's manual, besides the one that you can get in the forms and graphs. But if you want to look at it or you want to print it out to have it, while you're working with the students, or you want to share it with some of the instructional coaches that are working with your students, you can certainly do that. Even your speech and language person can help you and use this to score. So think about different ways you want to have it. There's your access skills I'm highlighting, and there's your entry point. We call that the level of complexity. How are they going to enter this? Are they going to use access skills or entry points? And I'm just going to remind you again, there's only one entry point. There's a lot more access skills because of the nature of access skills, but there's only one entry point. Now we want to look at this area. This is the demonstration of skills and concepts. These are the four areas I talked about. But before you even start, you really want to review these different rubric areas. You don't want to move to a 3 or 4 until your student has completed like this rubric 2 area. So you want to read each of those rubric areas and be sure that they have fulfilled the one before it before moving up. And then here's the independence, and Kevin will show you how to put that in. It's just a little different online how you're going to do it. And remember, I said you will pre-score that using the standardized rubric. I just talked about reviewing it. It's very important that you review the criteria before you start so you know what you're looking for. But if your student is using access skills, or if you have provided all the text, say you're doing using a communication book and you're talking about bubbles, but everything on that communication book is bubbles. They can't go away from that. You've provided all the text, or maybe you've given them a fill in the blank worksheet, or perhaps they just use a single word, like you write a sentence, my favorite color is, and they fill in that single word. Any of those will score 1 in the demonstration of skills and concepts. So that whole row will be 1, all 4 areas. The percent of independence is going to be based on the number of prompts relative to the total number of words or sentences. This is going to depend on your student, whether if you're scribing for them, maybe will speak in sentences, but maybe they're just going to be saying 1 or 2 words, which is fine. You know, maybe they start with 1 word on your baseline when you want to try to help them increase the number of words and how you're going to get that. So anytime you help the student get more words on the page, you would consider that a prompt. So if you talk about the weekend and the kids went to get pumpkin, and you're asking them, what did you do this weekend? And they say pumpkin. And you say, oh, you got a pumpkin. Was it big? And they say big. So you have big pumpkin now, but big wouldn't have been there if you hadn't helped them. So any words that you help them get on there is going to be a prompt. Also, if you do a sentence starter, that is going to be a prompt. And you're going to calculate that based on the number of words they say and the number of words that you wrote on there. We want to see the student's contribution. We know that you're all terrific at writing, but we want to see the student contribution. So unless it's illegible and you're writing underneath it, that's great. Or if you're scribing, remember you're scribing verbatim. You want to make sure we have the contribution of the student. And I said that the scores will verify the scores on your rubric. If your rubric isn't filled out, they can't verify it, and therefore it can't be scored because we aren't there. The only time that we change a score is if the evidence you send us does not reflect the scores on that rubric. So say you give us a list of single words, but you've given the student all 4s, we would definitely change that to reflect the evidence. So let's try this. I want to see how you would score this final writing sample, even though it's not a final. It says baseline, that's what it is. But I thought it would be a good one that we could use for Lacey to see what you would give it based on our rubric. So Kevin has shared the full page rubric in the chat. So I'll give you a moment to get that. So if you can't get that right now, just know that it says, I eat potatoes, turkey, apple pie. So if you want to jot that down, I eat potatoes, turkey, apple pie. So obviously this is scribed, that the The person told us that they scribed it. It says so over here in the narrative, what they did for the holiday weekend. I eat potatoes, turkey, apple pie, and it was 100% independent. So here's the rubric. This is the date. What would you give it for the level of complexity? And Kevin has shared the poll with you. So the level of complexity after looking at that, is it 2 access skills or 3 entry points? So you can fill that out. If you want to move you can move the poll over a little bit so you can see your screen, or if you pulled it up, you might have to go back and forth a little. Then you want to go on to expressions and ideas and content, and then knowledge of conventions and text structure, and then use of vocabulary. So go ahead and start scoring that sample. Okay, so the very first one is the level of complexity. So let's take a quick look over here at the measurable outcome. Lacey will use primary mode of communication to express or create a writing sample that is a narrative. Okay. She said it verbally and the teacher scribed. That is definitely an entry point. Access skill student is not going to be answering in this way. Okay. Well, there's quite a few of you that thought it was an access skill. This is definitely an entry point. So there's still a little confusion on that. Hopefully after Laura goes, you'll understand more thoroughly what an access skill student would be working on. For expressions and ideas, so let's take a look at expressions and ideas. No main idea. It was unclear, off topic. No, it wasn't. Let's go to number 2. It was related to assignment, but minimally, yes. It didn't have a lot of, only one detail or description. So I would give it a 2. I don't think I would move up to a 3 because it was very limited as far as description, but it's not wrong, but I would give it a 2 based on the rubric. For the next one, knowledge of conventions. Again, it had some text. I could understand it because the teacher scribed it, so the general meaning could be understood, though use of grammar was limited. I wouldn't move up because it says complete sentences with some errors. It wasn't complete sentences. I think the person who scribed may have put that period in pretty too quickly. So I would have given it a 2 as well, which a lot of you did. The next one is text structure, and a good portion of you also gave it a 2. So let's take a look at that. Sentence fragments, yes. Or one complete sentence used to express ideas, yes. So I can't give it a 3, right? Because it says at least 2 complete sentences were used, so no. And it wasn't just single words. There was a fragment in there. And then use of vocabulary. Was it unrelated? Nope. Vocabulary was related to the words in 2. You could, some people thought maybe a 3, vocabulary was functional and relevant. I could have gone 2 or 3. I personally probably would have given it a 2 though on the vocabulary. I think most of you gave it a 2, but some of you, I can see why you'd give it a 3. So again, if I gave it a 2 and you gave it a 3, and that's what you sent in on your rubric, we're not going to change that. If you gave them all 4s, we would change that. Okay, I hope that's clear. Thank you for participating because I think it helps. So There's the results. And we'll move forward. So we just did the poll. So this is a student who is at access skill level. The measurable outcome says that the student will activate a device within 15 seconds of the initial cue in an activity related to the creation of a written product. So let's see what the student did, because here's my brief description. Within 15 seconds of the initial cue, the student activated a switch with pre-recorded sentences to compose a narrative on her winter vacation. So those pre-recorded sentences were probably something that mom or dad sent in, a journal, a note that said, this is what we did over the holiday. That was pre-recorded sentences. And then what the student had to do was within 15 seconds, activate that switch, and those pre-recorded sentences would show up. So she was 25% independent, which, there's only four lines that had to be done. So she had to activate the switch 4 times. But this is the permanent product, is what you see here with I spent Christmas with my friends. But the teacher or the para put together the recorded sentences and composed the narrative. What we were taking the independence on was her participation or his participation in the creation of this. Okay. And again, Educator's Manual, page 24. We'll go over this again in a little while, but if you choose access skills for your students, because that's what they're working on, you will automatically have all ones because you are providing the text. There's no original text. It's all provided by the student, by the teacher. Perhaps your student is using a device, and we know it takes a lot of practice for our students to get used to using these devices, especially if they're dynamic displays where they push like color and then open it up and it has all the different colors, and then figuring out how to have it read back. There's a lot of involved for our students. So if your student is working on a dynamic display and you want to show us how they're putting the words together, you'll see in this case, the teacher took a screenshot of the actual device. And then when they printed it out, they were able to put whether the student was prompted or independent. And then we got the independence for it. But we could see that there were choices that the student was making. This wasn't all set up for just one thing. They had choices to make. They could be wrong. So this is the student expressing themselves, but still getting used to using the device. Sometimes these are supporting documentation, and sometimes they are our product. My favorite color is purple because it's pretty. This one I like to talk with. They didn't finish it. They apparently didn't know who they like to talk with. But you can see that would probably be a supporting documentation of this particular student. Or even maybe this would be a baseline. But these are helpful in helping us understand what the student has access to. So if you're using a communication book and you want to give us a screenshot or perhaps a word wall that the student is using to support the documentation of that final product, it's very helpful for us. So I just want to kind of go over everything again. There's no data chart required in this. You're going to include a skill survey, even though it's not here. I'm going to say it again. You're going to include a completed work sample description for each writing sample. You're going to make sure that the final sample reflects what the student did. It's going to be generated by the student. Samples of access skill level must include a final written product representing how that student participated in the creation of the sample. So I'm not going to get into that because Laura's going to show you some great examples of how that will work. Writing samples that include bathroom-related routines will not be scored, and they won't be counted towards the minimum requirement. We had an issue at the very beginning. I think we've nipped it in the bud, but because many of you here are new, I just want to remind you that anything done behind closed doors of the bathroom is not going to be scored for the ELA writing. There are plenty of other engaging topics that students like to talk about, their family, their pet, the latest movie they saw, a book you brought in. If you're doing things like in science, maybe you've done something in science and there's a writing piece that they did there, you can use it in both the science and for writing. If in the introduction, you know how we talked about yesterday, introducing the student, and I kind of gave you a little tip that, hey, maybe you want to use this introduction in your writing. Again, work with your speech and language person. Get some ideas. What can we talk about? How can we get this student to communicate and express themselves? This is usually their weakest area. So, you know, if we go from one word to two or two words to three, that's great. Maybe you can come up with a checklist for them that has icons on it so you don't have to keep prompting them. So they kind of look at that checklist and you have a way in which instead of saying how big was the pumpkin or what color was the pumpkin, maybe it's a checklist that shows those describing words or paint me a picture word that you can have them use, and that kind of takes that off of the prompting. So think about ways in which you can help your student communicate, but also reach out to those people that are already working with your students and use them. Share that rubric with them. So I think this is very funny. It came a few years ago. If you're coming here for a refresher, you have seen it, but it just cracks me up. And yes, I know there's a toilet in there, but it isn't about going to the bathroom. So the first one, it says, the cat is not happy with her soup. The back of her tail looks like them things you dust with. So the directive for the students was to caption these pictures. This one says, oh no, the lunch lady, the kids are going to eat me and the students are so hungry. I'm not like the other cafeteria food. And last but not least, it's when I first got potty trained. It didn't go as planned. I tried to hold myself up and I just literally fell in. So that's some examples of some writing samples done by the students. I'm going to turn it over to Kevin. He's going to show you how this all works in forms and graphs.
Thank you, Deb. Hello, everyone again. So as Deb mentioned, we'll pop back into forms and graphs, and we'll look at how to create these things, the work descriptions for both final and baseline, and the rubrics that go along with. So give me one moment. I'll pop the screens over, and we'll come back and take a look at the forms and graphs. So one moment. Okay, so here we are back on forms and graphs, and just a little bit of a reminder, same reminder if you were with us this morning. I'm not going to walk you through all the kind of lead up to this of creating accounts and building student lists. If you need that, that was in the core concepts that was yesterday and last week. And all those materials, just again, I'd put it in the chat a couple times. But just a refresher, everything that we've handed out to you, including PDF versions of the educator's manual and the resource guides, you are here. Here's the PowerPoints for the writing. There's a separate one for what Laura will do at the end of the session for access skills for ELA writing. So those are both here. All that material lives there, but that core concepts is where we went over kind of the beginning of everything. And just another reminder that all these coming soons, those will become the links to the actual recordings as we get them captioned and then get them posted to the DESE YouTube page, which takes a minute or two. But eventually we'll let you know when they're ready, but just keep checking back as well. All of these will be links that you can go and click and watch any of these, even the access skills, the administrators, you can watch whatever you'd like once they're all ready to go. But back to forms and graphs, I'm going to sign back in. We'll keep, so writing, it doesn't matter what grade, what student you're working at, it all works the same. So we'll just use our Alex Keaton sample that we've been building out. Remember, there's always that link between the skill survey and creating a strand. It will not let me do a strand until I've completed the requirement for the skill survey. So we can go into our skill surveys. Here are two. We did one at the core concepts. If you came with us with science, we did science. But now we need a ELA writing. So we'll drop in a new skill survey by clicking add a new skill survey. Go to survey. And even though there's different disciplines of writing, different variants of narrative, opinion, argument, it's all one skill survey. So you don't have to match those up, just one overall skill survey. It doesn't matter what type of writing you're working on. It's just the same skill survey for all of them. So ELA writing, give it a date. And same as before, where every line needs a response. So this time there's only 9. So you're just looking at 1 through 9, and looking at the level of skill and determining, is this something the student is just unable to do independently, or how independent are they likely to be able to complete a skill like that? So key to completing it in order to create the strand is just every single line, in this case 1 through 9, has to have a selection. Little reminder, if you skip one and you think you did it, if you just save this, or if you leave this page and come back, once they're all green, you know you did them. If I had skipped one, that number would not be greened out. It's pretty obvious which one you have to go back and make a selection for. That's the skill survey. And then we can jump right into our strands list. And here are the strands we have going for Alex Keaton at this point. But now we need to address ELA writing. So we'll add a new strand. Go to the cover sheet. We want ELA. And you'll notice here we do have a choice, because there's different learning standards associated with each of these types. And then the one entry point does slightly change according, and I'll show you how to do one, but just know that they all work the same. It doesn't matter, opinion versus narrative, they'll work identical. So let's just create a narrative, select. And so far, if you were with us in the core concepts where we looked at the rest of ELA for language and reading and math, it looks kind of the same. We've got all the populated fields that it knows at this point. Learning standard, we can select. Remember that if I want to look at the full list of learning standards, I can bring up the PDF of the resource guide, because I just have I won't scroll all the way down, but whatever grade you're at, 3 to 8 in high school, you find the grade, and there are all the standards. Obviously, nobody's doing pre-K, but same idea of just going to the proper grade from pre-K, kindergarten, all the way up to the grade that's meaningful, and you can find the learning standard. So that's all the same. So, and remember, big red button's your friend. When you click Get LS Text, you'll notice that it drops in that learning standard text. So until you do that, it hasn't attached itself to that strand. So just remember to click the Get LS Text. As we go, pretty much the same. We've got level of complexity. We can ignore that if we're going to use this Find Entry Points button. It will populate the level of complexity for me. And then to find those skills, this is where it starts to take a bit of a turn. Is normally it would bring up that multiple list of entry points across all the tabs of the different grades. But now in writing, there's only one. So I'm in narrative, so it just adds that is a narrative. And then if I'm doing entry points, which a majority of you will be, there's only one to choose from. It's the access skills. So no grade tabs, just says all grades up here. There's no going up or down. It's either your entry points or your access skills. And Laura will talk about what students might really be appropriate for access skills. But you'll notice they're just tasks about how they interact in an activity related to a written product. So those are different specific tasks for the access skills. So you do have a choice to make if you're doing access skills, but entry points is always just one choice. So for most of you, it'll be a pretty easy selection. You click, it'll still bring you back, add the student's first name and will. Slight difference here if it doesn't ask for accuracy and independence in the measurable outcome, just independence. The accuracy is captured on the rubrics itself in those 4 dimensions Deb was talking about: vocab, knowledge of conventions, those 4. So it's just asking about what is the goal of what percent independent are they going to create these samples. 6 remains, where if there's modifications, if they're using a system, particularly here, it might be helpful if it's not obvious in the samples that you're doing. If the student is using some sort of device and communication system, it's probably most appropriate of all the strands to put it here of how they're generating those samples that you're putting in. If it's clearly not obvious or described somewhere else, it's a good place to capture 6, but not a required field per se for most of you. But then we come down to the bottom. This is where it's very different than what we looked at when we were doing a math strand or language strand or reading strand, where we have no data charts. All we have are labels and rubrics. So Deb had mentioned it, that the baseline and the final, they're identical. Just one says baseline and one says final. But same idea. So if I want to create the baseline, which should come first, you click baseline, and you get a work sample for a baseline. So we'll go to the evidence page, and you're just giving it the information, pretty similar to what we saw the other day in the core concepts for all the other strands, where again, we're only going to label the independence. So we can say that this baseline, we're able to do 80%, and then a description of, oops, nice healthy amount of characters. You can describe what it is that occurred to create this baseline, and then same as everything else with the date, and then self-evaluation if you need to describe it, or if you want to say see attached, if you've got a standalone that you use for everything. If you need more information on self-evaluation, that too was also covered in the core concepts. That's the same across any strand. It's just about how the student is reflecting on what they did. And that's it, that just those few fields, and then you attach it to the baseline sample. We can go back to the cover sheet. The other version of that is the final. And you'll notice once I open it, it's exactly the same, just one says final. But it wants the same amount of information. So I'll show you a bit of a completed sample after, but those are the 2 components of the description labels. But the one that's really different, if we come back, is the idea of this scoring rubric. So when we click for the rubric, we'll get a placeholder for that rubric, and we can go in. So we'll give it a date again of whatever it is that when that piece of evidence, the writing sample that you're attaching it to, they should have the same date. And then we have a rubric. So we can quickly scroll top to bottom just so you can see. But you'll notice when I hover on it, I get from a pointer to a little hand. So you can just click or tap right on the rubric itself to make your selections. So if you want entry points, for level of complexity, which is what we selected, we select 3, and then these are the 4 dimensions that create the demonstration of skills and concepts or accuracy. So expression of ideas, knowledge of conventions, text structure, use of vocab. So you simply hover and click, and it'll turn this purpley blue to let you know what your selection is. And it's not a one and done, you just hover and change as appropriate as for the sample that you're attaching this to until you get to independence. So if you try to hover and click, it's just going to keep selecting the text. It's not going to select and turn that purpley blue. And the reason why, if you look at all of these, there are ranges of independence in these cases. So 76 to 100, 51 to 75. We need the actual percentage because we take all 3 samples and average them together. So we don't average the ranges. We want the actual percent of independence for each sample. So over here, you'll notice there's a little drop down for percent independence. This is where you'll put in that amount. So if I put in 80%, you'll notice it'll select the independence for me. Throws people sometimes just because you're click, 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 and then you get to this and you don't understand why it's not selecting it. It just wants that real, like, definitive percentage, and it'll select the appropriate range for you. So just remember independence, you want that drop down. You can print these independently as you do one sample and kind of compile as you go. I'll show you again where you can stitch all of these together in just a moment here. But that's really it. So there's only 3 components. So there's the baseline and then the final and the rubric that you do for 3 samples. So let's take a quick look at what that might look like, what you might expect to see when you're close to complete for a student. So let's look at, in this case, it's a grade 3, but grade is somewhat irrelevant for what's required. When we go in, this time we've got an opinion argument. Selected my learning standard. I'm working at entry points. Notice it says NA. I didn't point that out before. That it's not a real one in the resource guide. This is kind of a global entry point that's used across every entry point for writing. So it doesn't really exist in the resource guide. The access skills do, but these do not. So it just puts in not available. And then when you are done, you should have something that looks like this. Some people like to group their samples together. I personally like it like this, where you've got your baseline and then a sample label final, and then they attached the related rubric. And it's a good use of that my description. And just as a reminder, where that comes from is when you're in a sample, this little yellow box at the top, whatever you type here is what shows up here. So it's just a nice little kind of grouping descriptions that you can give yourself so you know, okay, this is the rubric that goes with that sample. So you know you have them all, you know your dates are matched up. It's not a bad idea to put the date and a little description of what it's aligned to. So you should have some version of this where you've got a baseline, final with rubric, final with rubric, final with rubric. So 3 samples with 3 completed rubrics. And then when you print from the strand cover sheet, you can print multiple. It'll give you everything but the rubrics. So we'll get the cover sheet, it'll grab that skill survey and toss it in there, and then we'll get our baseline, final 1, final 2, final 3. Much like the data charts, it does group the rubrics separately. So click here to do the rubrics. These again will squeeze in portrait technically, but much better if you change these to landscape when you print them. And then so we've got our 1, 2, and 3. So you stitch that all together with your actual writing samples, and that's a complete writing submission for, in this case, a grade 3 student. So most people will kind of pick a text type, or so they'll go with opinion argument and stay within there of just doing 3 samples of a opinion argument. But let's say you wanted to mix it up. You wanted to do one narrative as well. So let's pretend these last 2 don't exist. So what do we have? We've got a baseline and then a final with a rubric and a final with a rubric. So we've got 2 of the 3, but we know we need 3 final samples. Because they are linked to a sort of somewhat unique entry point and learning standard, all these standards are tied to the text type. What you need to do is go back to your strand list, add a new strand, and add another version of the writing in order to link those things up. I already forgot where we were. I think we're going after a narrative. I think we had an opinion. So let's put a narrative in here. And then these are all the learning standards that are appropriate for a narrative text. And you'll notice when we do our entry point this time, we've got narrative. And then all you have to do down here, this question comes up a lot. Do you have to do a baseline again if you change text types? No, as long as you do one, it doesn't matter in what text type. So you don't have to do a baseline for the narrative. In this case, for this student, all we need to do is a work description final and a scoring rubric. So you print these out separate and put them together back with the other one that you did. So you can mix and match them. You can do one of each. There's 3 options. You can do it all in one, but just know if you want to kind of mix them up, you have to create a new strand each time and then stitch it together kind of outside of the strand itself. So that's the one catch if you're not going to stick with one text type. So that's writing. I mean, there's not a whole lot to it, but just remember that that's the formula. 1 baseline and 3 final samples, all with a scored rubric attached to it. And that's the requirement for writing. So I will hand it back to Deb now, and she can wrap things up and we can go over questions.
Excellent. Thank you, Kevin. As always, very thorough. Just to let you know, it's okay if you want to do all 3 the same with writing, but some people like to do different things to match what they're doing in their classroom. So again, like I said, if you were doing science, maybe you had the informative writing that you wanted to do. So before we go on to the questions, I just want to remind people that were not here at the beginning that at 2:19 we will pause for a couple of minutes until the emergency signal goes off, and then we will come back on. So whatever we're in the middle of at 2:19, we will pause. Laura will let us know that we're going to pause, and we will stop. I think that's all I wanted to say about that. If you're with us because you're still new, I see in the questions and see what I can answer. So we did talk about students who cannot write because they're unable to, but if they use pictures or AAC devices to complete writing samples, that's perfectly fine. We just want to see their choices, because if you're giving them all the text in order to write something, or if it's an errorless choice, then the student is not making the decision. The teacher has made the decision. So that's the way that works. We are looking at expressive communication and always continually working on helping our students do that. Let's see. If the student uses an introduction as a writing sample, should I make a photocopy of the sample and use the original as the official sample? Either one, it would be fine to use the original one as the introduction and then make a copy for the final writing sample, or maybe that is a baseline. Maybe you would do that as a baseline. So Aaron, I would like to see 3 distinctly different writing samples. So if you're working on my favorites, so that's an opinion piece, I would work up to having all all three on one final writing sample, I wouldn't give one sentence per sample. So maybe you're going to talk about all the favorite things they like as one sample. Maybe you're going to do a newsletter home to mom and dad, or you're going to, if it's limited that you're thinking about, you can do that. What I did at school. So you want it to be three different, but you wouldn't do one sample with one sentence and the next time do a sample with two sentences. You're going to work on this, excuse me, for you have some time. So this is September. You got time to work on the writing because you're going to be doing this. The whole MCAS-Alt, right, is assessing. It's all embedded in your teaching, right? And so if you're doing something and maybe the class is writing about something, you can certainly use that, but you're going to just keep working on that student improving. Oh, thank you, Margaret, about calculating the independence. So if you have, say the student has 10 words and you prompted 5 of them, then that would be 50% independent. So it's just how many words you have and then how many were done independently. So that's how, and you can do it by the word or the sentence, whichever gives you a better independent score. Some kids are able to speak and they'll give you like a paragraph because they don't have to write it. So if it's easier for you to calculate the independence that way, that's fine by the sentence. Look for our newsletters. You will get them now that you've come to these trainings. Remember to sign up for a review session. Give your administrator a heads up that you'll be needing some time to go to that. And I'm here for questions, and we hope to see you at the Access Skills on the 16th if you need it, or at the administrator's workshop, or the update if you came here for a refresher. So have a wonderful rest of your afternoon, and thank you again.